also benefit from this webinar. So you'll get a pop-up that asks you about recording, so that we can make sure that make sure that this is recorded. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm Amy Maracle. I'm a research scientist in the Alcohol Research Group at the Public Health Institute. I co-lead the I-STARR project with Dr. Carmen Masson, who's a professor of psychiatry in the School of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. The team also includes co-investigators Sarah Zemore and Lenny Jason, as well as biostatisticians Meena Subbaraman and Libo Lee, and communication specialists Diane Schmidt and Dustin Kebzu. The project coordinator for this work is Quinoja Capitani. Next slide, please. So the I-STARR projects and activities are guided by a 17-member advisory board comprised of a diverse group of leaders from across the country. Most of our advisory board members wear many different hats, but as a whole, they represent recovery and recovery housing leaders, treatment providers and payers, national policy advocates, as well as researchers and educators. Some of our advisory board members may be in our audience today, but we also have many of our advisory board members who are presenters in this webinar series. Next slide, please. So before we launch in today's webinar and I talk about who's presenting today, we'd like to do some quick polling to get a sense of who's in the room. So there are just 3 questions in our poll today, and you'll see them listed on this slide. The first question is basically who you are, so we get a sense of who's in the audience. And then we have a couple of questions that are really germane to the presentation today. So that's without safety protocols in place, how likely do you think recovery housing residents are to divert medications that are narcotics, stimulants, or CNS depressants? And the last question is it legal for recovery residences to deny an application solely based on a medication that an applicant has prescribed? So let's launch the poll so that folks can enter answers for those questions. And when we get a critical mass, usually about 70 or 80% of respondents will bring up the results from the poll. Are we ready to bring up the results now? How close are we? Excellent. So very interesting proportion of folks who are in the other category in terms of their role in recovery housing. Folks who've responded other, if you could just type in what your role is, that would be fantastic. We do have a 27% who are recovery residence operators, but we also have other folks as well, some residents, wonderful, clinicians, and researchers or other academics. In terms of likeliness to divert, we have somewhat likely being the most popular response. And then for the legality of denying applications solely based on the nature of medication, we have the majority, 67% saying no, but there are also other responses as well. So given those results, I think that folks will really enjoy this presentation, because we're hoping that folks will come away with this webinar with a better sense of the factors to consider when answering questions like this. If we go to the next slide, please. So without further ado, I want to introduce today's presenter, Jason Howell, who I've known and worked with for over a decade at this point. He is someone who's on my speed dial for information about recovery housing and actually recovery anything. Jason's a person in long-term recovery from mental health and substance use issues. He has an MBA from Texas A&M University and is a recovery support peer specialist and supervisor. Jason is the executive director of Recovery People, a 501c3 nonprofit that engages, educates, and empowers changemakers to use their lived experience to help others affected by substance use and related mental health challenges. He's also a founder and former board president of the National Alliance for Recovery Residences, or NAR, and he's a national speaker and has co-authored several peer-reviewed journal articles. And with that introduction, I want to hand things off to Jason Howell. Next
Thanks a
slide,
lot,
please.
Amy, and thank you for having me back. This time we're going to talk about a topic that's a little juicier than last time. It's screening applicants prescribed medications of concern. And I really appreciate everybody in attendance today. Next slide. So we can't talk about this topic without acknowledging the important role of screening applicants and maintaining a safe and supportive recovery housing environment. But you know, there's a really big intersection between recovery housing and the law. And so with this particular topic, we need to take a look at civil rights law. We need to also talk about substances of concern, including medications of concern. And a lot of the slides early on is really kind of priming our brain, kind of doing the basics that will all lead to us taking a look at some logic models there towards the end, logic models around screening applicants, as well as a logic model around reasonable accommodation. Next slide, please. And I should highlight, underline, put in flashing lights. I am not an attorney. Nothing I say today should be considered legal advice. I think it's very important for all recovery housing to have an attorney that they work with, somebody that understands the various aspects of the law and also understands your particular recovery home. Because with that, they're going to be able to give you some legal counsel on developing policies and procedures and processes, including screening individuals. And for those of you that identified as being owner-operators or residents, my hope is at the end of this, you'll be able to have a more productive conversation with your attorney. Next slide, please. So why even have this conversation? I think it's, I love this quote from NAR, the National Alliance for Recovery Residences. Most persons with a substance use disorder return from treatment or institutions into living environments that enable addictive lifestyles. So it's very important to offer individuals recovery housing where they can have a safe, sober, and supportive living environment where they can initiate and sustain their recovery. Next slide. You know, but I think the paradox question behind all this is how can we have a recovery home that maintains a safe and supportive living environment while upholding individuals' civil rights, their disability rights, especially when residents are prescribed medication that is one, a substance of concern, and two, treats the underlying condition that may be causing their disability to begin with. So that's the paradox around all this. And hopefully at the end, we'll be able to take a very complicated issue and make it a little bit more easier to understand. Next slide. So I did notice that many of you, 50%, are really not from the recovery housing field. So I wanted to start with some basics. You know, we're talking about individuals with a substance use disorder. I'm a person with a substance use disorder. What does that mean? It's a result of misusing alcohol or drugs in a manner, a situation, amount, or frequency that could cause harm to ourselves or those around us. It's a progressive disease over time. Repeated misuse can change the way that the brain functions. It impacts the brain's circuits governing substance seeking, reward stress, and executive functioning like decision-making and self-control. So when we talk about monitoring or restricting substances, we're doing it in a very mindful and important reason. It's to create and maintain a sober and safe living environment for those seeking recovery. Next slide. And I've used this phrase, substances of concern. And what I'm talking about are substances that have abuse potential, misuse potential, and diversion risk. There's lots of different substances of concern. Some are regulated substances like alcohol and tobacco. Some of these substances you can find at your local supplement store, convenience store, or head shop. Some of them are over-the-counter products that you could get at the grocery store or our local pharmacy. And then some of the substances of concern are prescription medications and controlled substances. And Dustin, I'm sorry, I'm being slow. Could you advance to the next slide? And this is really what we're going to focus today on is the substances of concern, which are prescribed medications that also have addictive potential, which are these controlled substances. Next slide. So in 1970, Congress passed a law that established the DEA and the FDA, and they created a scheduling system for controlled substances. And this chart kind of lays out the scheduled substances with some examples of each. What you'll notice about this is Schedule 1 are the substances that are the most addictive, of most concern. And then it ranges all the way down to Schedule 5. And while they do have abuse potential, it's of less concern than Schedule 1, just to kind of give you that range. And if you could go to the next slide. What I'm showing here is that Schedule 1 substances from a federal perspective, from a DEA and FDA perspective, do not have any medical use. And so really those are not the ones that we're focused on today. If you have a resident that comes in on Schedule 1, that there's not a gray area there. Those are not allowed. But Schedule 2 through 5, these are drugs that have addictive potential, abuse potential, diversion potential, but they have an accepted medical use. And this is where it gets more complicated for recovery housing. We want to maintain that safe environment, but at the same time, individuals may be being prescribed some medications that can be used to ameliorate their disability. Next slide. This is really a graphic that kind of maps out the rest of the presentation. When we're talking about individuals with a history of substance use, only a subsection of those are going to be interested in recovery housing because it's going to fit with their goals. And when we talk about screening individuals, this is really about matching individuals with safe, supportive recovery housing. We're screening applicants in or out as part of a process that's guided by policies and procedures that's really aimed at matching individuals. So as you think through this, think about what those policies and procedures should be that are really going to link individuals to the type of recovery housing and supports that they need. And really, before we get into screening, there's lots of work that can be done as far as empowering choice. And even during the screening process, we really need to think about, upholding someone's civil rights and using reasonable accommodations to do that. All right, so let's do a deeper dive in each one of these sections. Next slide. And, individuals with a history of substance use issues, they really range dramatically in their disease severity. They also range dramatically in their stages of change. And because of that, we need a lot of different options. And recovery housing is only one of those options for a particular population. And for individuals that are seeking a pathway to recovery that includes an alcohol and illicit drug-free lifestyle, those are the individuals that are best matched with recovery housing. Next slide. So for me, it's all about empowering choice. Before we start talking about screening people in and out, let's talk about having them opt in or opt out. And prior to screening applicants in or out, recovery housing should empower choice, and it's the individual's choice. We need to communicate these things to the individual, their family members, and to their referral agents. But we need to make sure that when somebody's referring someone to us, it's not their wish for their family member or their wish for their client. We really need to be empowering an individual. And by doing what I'm talking about is really encouraging that individual to have their own definition of recovery, to really understand, so what is their pathway of recovery? And with that, they'll be able to self-determine whether recovery housing in general or a particular recovery home is the right fit. On the other side of that coin, it's important for recovery housing to know what their recovery culture is, what the recovery homes definition of recovery, and really be transparent about that and get it out there. That way, we're able to see whether it's a right fit even before individuals submit an application. The third bullet really highlights that there's different types of recovery homes, and we need to be very transparent about what's the capability of a particular recovery home, all in making sure that it's the right fit for an individual. Next slide. So there's lots. I talked about important that we encourage people to have their definition of recovery, and for the recovery home to have a definition of recovery. I find it easy to look at other definitions and then adapt that for me personally. This is a definition that's used by a lot of individuals. It was developed by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, back in 2012. It's a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and strive to reach their full potential. So a lot of times we just see that definition. But underneath that definition, they also identified 4 supportive domains: health, home, purpose, and community. And when you really look at the full definition, including the supportive domains, you'll notice that under health, I've highlighted a phrase in the definition that says overcoming or managing one's disease or symptoms, excuse me, for example, abstaining from the use of alcohol, illicit drugs, and non-prescribed medications if one has an addiction problem. So that phrase is in the SAMHSA definition of recovery, and really highlights the importance of many people choosing that pathway, of choosing an abstinence pathway or a pathway that is free of alcohol and illicit drugs. Next slide. There's other definitions of recovery that I encourage you to take a look at as you develop your own definition for yourself or your definition for your recovery home. There's the Betty Ford Foundation definition: a voluntary maintained lifestyle characterized by sobriety, personal health, and citizenship. And I definitely want to give a shout out to the Public Health Institute and the Alcohol Research Group that is the principal investigators of this program. They did a couple of years back. They had a research program called "What is Recovery," and that is a really rich data. They reached out to individuals in recovery and asked them, what are the characteristics of your recovery? And so I definitely wanted to give that research a shout out that you can use as a resource in formulating your own. Next slide, please. So the definition of recovery housing, there's some federal definitions that you can use as well. Again, this is all in the spirit of being transparent, of really kind of marketing, if you will, out there. What is the culture of recovery in this particular recovery home? What is recovery housing in general, so that people can opt in or know if recovery housing is right for them. So this is the definition in statute. It is Congress passed the Support Act of 2018, and in that they define recovery housing as shared living environments free from alcohol and illicit drugs. So again, underscoring the importance of having a sober and safe living environment. Next slide. Not only in statute, but we've got federal agencies that have defined recovery housing as well. This is a definition from SAMHSA and is in SAMHSA's Guide to Recovery Housing. They define recovery housing as safe, healthy, family-like, substance-free living environments. And then that last bullet I'll highlight, they define substance-free as not prohibiting FDA-approved medications if they're taken as prescribed. Next slide. You know, I'm realizing that there's about half of those of us in the room don't come from a recovery housing background or are not owner operators. So I'll highlight that there are different types of recovery homes. The National Alliance for Recovery Residences have identified 4 different types. They're called levels of support and are represented here. One way that you can delineate between the different types or levels of support is in their staffing and governance. And if you'll go to the next slide. What you'll notice, it's really the higher levels of support, meaning 3s and 4, that have the staffing structure that would be able to implement a lot of the diversion risk management approaches. That's not saying that level 1s and 2s don't have any diversion management options to them, but a lot of the ones that we can think of, really you need staff to implement those. And so that's level 3 and 4. Next slide. The other way you can distinguish between the different levels of support is looking at their service bundles. What are the services that they're being able to provide or that they are providing? At a very high level, all recovery homes are providing, housing, non-clinical services, and or clinical services. And if we'll go to the next slide, this is another look at the same 3 types. So to varying degrees, recovery housing is cited at the intersection of housing, recovery support, and treatment. And why I'm really highlighting this is there's different laws that regulate housing and laws that regulate treatment. And so if we'll go to the next slide. Really levels 1, 2, and 3, these are your non-clinical recovery housing. They're primarily regulated by housing regulations, whereas level 4, because they provide clinical services, they trigger state licensure or a regulation of clinical services. And why that's important, and we'll take a look at some of these housing regulations in the next slide. So there at top, you'll see that I listed fair housing laws and the American with Disability Act, or ADA, including some others. But we want to focus in on those first 2. And if you go to the next slide. These are typically what we're talking about when someone's civil rights or disability rights. And this is important because as we talked about that paradoxical question up front, is we want to create a safe environment within the recovery home, but we also need to uphold an individual's right to take medication, especially if that medication is helping alleviate their disability. Next slide. So when we think about the ADA and the federal fair housing laws, they establish protected classes. The protected classes are race, color, national origin, religion, sex, family status, and disability. So from a housing perspective, you can't discriminate against someone solely based on their protected class status. So you couldn't discriminate against someone solely based on their race, their national origin, or their disability. And note that persons in recovery from substance use meet the civil rights definition of disabled. Something also to note is that if someone is engaged in illegal activity, then these protections don't extend to them. So if you have an individual who is diverting their medication, engaging in illicit behavior, these protections do not extend to them. But if you have an individual that is prescribed medication, is taking it legally, then I mean, they're taking their medication as prescribed. They're doing what they're supposed to do. And if you, as a recovery housing provider, discriminate against them because they're taking that medication, that's what raises civil rights red flags that you could be engaging in discriminatory activities. Next slide, please. So it's complicated. And so how do we take that all that's complicated and simplify it? Create a screening process that's could not only be implemented maybe by the owner operator, but really everybody in the organization. You make it very, transparent and understanding. This is how we do things here. Again, this is a sample logic model. I recommend that you work with your attorney to develop a logic model that is most appropriate for your organization, your level of support. And really, we don't have time to do a big deep dive here. I think in the resources, I point you to a training that's been developed by Dr. Steven Stanislav. He has a doctorate in pharmacology and pharmacy, and he also is in recovery. And so he's developed a several hour training that does a deeper dive around this. But in short, you can when you're looking at a particular substance, ask yourself, is it legal? Has it been proven safe? And has it been proven effective? And if the answer is no to those, well, then you can consider disallowing that. The other note I put in there is universally offer a reasonable accommodation process, because as a layperson, you may not answer those questions appropriately. You may say, oh, no, that has not been proven safe, and deny it, but maybe it has been proven safe. So you want to create a safety mechanism to make sure that you're not discriminating anybody. And that's why I recommend that even if you're going to be, if you disallow it, make sure that you're offering somebody a reasonable accommodation around that. Or not the accommodation, but the opportunity to submit a reasonable accommodation. So if you ask those questions and they say yes, we'll then move to the next box over to the right and ask, does this substance have the potential for abuse, misuse, or diversion? If the answer is no, well, then considering allowing it. Why wouldn't you? What's more complicated is when you ask yourself that question is like, oh yeah, this may have, misuse or diversion potential. You may consider allowing it if you have the ability to implement appropriate diversion kind of risk management procedures and allowing them to take the medication and still make the house safe for that individual and everybody else in the home. You may say, well, no. And so if you're thinking about screening someone out, again, make sure that you offer them a reasonable accommodation process, making it, and that will help you ensure that you're upholding their civil rights. So we've been talking about this thing called reasonable accommodation. So let's move to the next slide and even and kind of define what that is. So a reasonable accommodation is a change, an exception, or an adjustment to a rule, policy, practice, or service that may be necessary for a person with disabilities to have an equal opportunity to enjoy housing. It's meant to eliminate barriers that would cause discrimination. And remember that all persons with disabilities have the right to request or be provided a reasonable accommodation at any time. And that includes when somebody's applying to live in a recovery home or they're going through that screening process. Next slide, please. So once again, Jason has this handy dandy logic model. I like logic models because things are complicated and I need to try to make sense of them. I need to try to find a way to get my head around it. Logic models work for me. And so I offer up, this is a framework that you can use in your recovery home as well. Again, adapt this to work with your attorney, adapt this to make sense for your organization. It's just a way of it's a tool that not only the owner operator, but everybody in the recovery housing organization can understand that this is the process that we need to go through. So again, we're going to start in the top left-hand corner, and that first box, the question is, was the reasonable accommodation, made by or on behalf of a person with a disability? So if the answer is no, well, then the accommodation's not attached to disability or the ADA. In reality, when we're talking about recovery housing, everybody in the recovery home is a person with a disability. At a minimum, it's a disability of addiction or a substance use disorder. So that first column it's true for reasonable accommodations, but within recovery housing, we need to move over to the second box. And that question is there a disability-related need for the accommodation? So if they're requesting an accommodation, you need to think, is this really related to their disability or alleviating the disability or them being able to fully enjoy the benefits of living in the recovery home? So if the answer to that is no, what they're asking is not related to their disability, you could consider denying it. But really, our focus today is talking about these medications of concern. And so it's likely going to be tied to their health in some format, whether it's their physical health, mental health, et cetera. So you're likely in this scenario going to say, yes, it is related to their disability, and we need to move to the next set of boxes. And these are more nuanced questions. The first question is, would providing the accommodation impose an undue financial or administrative burden to the recovery home? The second question is, would it functionally alter the nature of the recovery home? And as we think about those two questions, you can understand why I spent so much time at the beginning of the presentation really laying the foundation behind all this, including the different types of recovery homes, what recovery homes are in the context of the bigger world. So if you answer no to both of those questions, then consider granting the reasonable accommodation. I mean, why wouldn't you? I think it gets more complicated when you answer yes to one of the two questions, whether it's an undue burden or it fundamentally changes the program to offer that accommodation. So if you answer yes, then your instinct is like, all right, we've got to deny this application. We've got to deny the reasonable accommodation. And really, you're legally required to work with the individual to see if there's an alternative accommodation that can be made. There might be an accommodation that they hadn't thought of and hadn't requested that would be a win-win for both. It could meet their needs as well as not be a burden and not fundamentally change the program. And if you're not able to come to that amicable accommodation and you realize that this individual is just not a right fit for your recovery home, I really ask you to think about, how can you get them connected with a resource in the community that is a right fit for them? Because we just don't want to deny anyone. We do this work to be of service. So there's still an opportunity for you to be of service to this individual, even if they're not a right fit for your particular recovery home. All right, and next slide. So I think that's the end of the prepared slides. Amy, I feel like I talked real fast, so hopefully that means that we have more time for questions later.
We do have time for discussion, and just an amazing presentation, Jason. I know that you tried to pack a lot into this presentation to just kind of give people a lay of the land. We've tried to cover broadly as much as we could, but there's a great deal that could go into each slide that Jason presented on. So to make sure that you guys have all the resources that you need to make sure that you can find that detailed information, we've prepared a list of resources for you guys. Next slide, please. So this is where you can do some further reading on topics that Jason brought up, so lists of other tools and resources, and also additional training and guidance on these topics. Jason, do you want to say anything about these resources that you've listed?
No, other than this is the kind of the tip of the iceberg. I think once you step into this, you learn more about what you don't know and start researching even more and more. And it is complicated. And so I just encourage people to just wade in and know that it's a journey. You know, you've heard me say this a couple different times. You know, I would really encourage if you're operating a recovery home, find an attorney. There's plenty of attorneys in recovery that kind of understand what recovery housing is and can help you navigate, you know, what's best for the recovery home and how to uphold individuals' rights.
Excellent. And we've tried to drop into the chat kind of along the way these resources. And then we've also kind of the bulk of everything that's listed on the slide, we've also dropped into the chat as well. So let's go to the next slide, which brings us to where we can take a pause for a few minutes and do some Q&A and have some discussion. Jason brought up a lot of really good points, but this is really complicated and tricky territory. So we would like to hear what's on your mind and what you guys are thinking about as recovery residence operators and stakeholders in recovery housing. So feel free to raise your hand. We can call on you, but we can also read questions in the chat. So you're welcome to drop your question in the chat as well. And Diane, I'm going to hand things off to you to facilitate this discussion.
Okay, thanks, Amy. I think our first question goes to Christine. Christine, do you want to unmute and ask your question for Jason?
Sure. Thank you, Jason, for your presentation. My question is, it has to do with the legalities of what's considered discrimination. So if we work for an agency or an organization where the general values of the organization say that recovery is complete abstinence from any addictive substance, and that's part of, because we're a Christian-based organization, for example, that's part of what's been adopted. Do we have the ability to then just say that certain medications, we are MAT accepting, we do accept MAT, but we don't accept, for example, at present, accept benzodiazepines for managing anxiety. That's a medication we don't allow. Are we violating basic principles and making those kinds of calls within kind of the religious context of our agency and organization? Are we in a mix, in a muddle with the federal guidelines and federal rules?
I think you ask a really good question. And again, I'm not an attorney, and this is really where you should reach out to an attorney and understand how to navigate this. And regardless of the policy and procedure you set, there's going to be some legal risk around this. I've often wondered from a religious freedom perspective, from a faith-based perspective, you know, sometimes the courts on many topics have deferred to that or really wanted to uphold religious freedom. And so if a recovery home came from a perspective of like, no, we're not allowing substances due to our faith, I've not seen a court case go to the courts, but I could easily see one do that. Now, it's interesting that you're allowing some medications, but not others. I think the courts would look at that and say, how can you pick and choose? Yeah, I don't know. I think that this is the part of case law that hasn't unfolded yet.
Thank you.
Yeah, I feel like I just, you know, continue to muddy the water, but it is muddy.
Jason, would it be helpful to go back to your logic models? One of those as we're answering these questions, if that's helpful in kind of directing people how to think about things.
We totally could. I think with this particular question, it's what is the basis of denying, and it's with the logic models, we were just focused in on the way that I developed them was just really looking at does the is the medication or the substance that we're talking about, is it effective, is it legal, is it helping mitigate someone's disability. And this particular question, I think that is kind of saying, yes, we acknowledge that MAT or MLUD is accepted, but that benzodiazepines are not. I think that's where it gets even more muddy. It's like, well, either medications do help or they don't, and then how are you being able to kind of carve out some medicines where you're not others? And I think that if Christine's organization is doing that, then they need to develop kind of their justification around that. Now, whether the courts would say that's discriminatory or not, I think if we ever see a court case, I would be really interested to see the results.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks, Christine, for that question. We don't have any other questions in the chat, so welcome anyone to drop something in or raise your hand. We still have a few more minutes for questions. This is a great time to ask Jason, who's an expert on this topic, for any questions that you have about your own recovery house.
I have a question, actually. I'm going to jump in. So Jason, you referenced a couple of times the importance of consulting with a lawyer around these issues. What is the best way you think to find a lawyer and someone who would be knowledgeable about recovery housing and laws that are germane, kind of have a sense of what's going on with recovery housing? Because I'm guessing that not all lawyers do.
Yes, recovery housing unto itself is a very specialized part of the law. And so there are attorneys out there that do work in fair housing law. So I think that if I were looking for an attorney, that I would try to find somebody that is familiar with fair housing law. And then from there, if they happen to also understand recovery housing, even better. You may need to help educate them around the nuances. There are, addiction does not discriminate. And so there are attorneys that are in recovery. And so you may even be able to find, attorneys that come with that lived experience as well. I know many attorneys that used to live in recovery housing. So they're out there. We just don't have a directory.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks, Amy. We have a question from Etta Funky. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Oh,
and sorry if I
you.
mispronounced your name as well.
You actually did well. You tried. It's an African name anyway. Sorry. Thank you so much. I'm Adi Funke Additional. I'm a medical practitioner, a public health physician, field epidemiologist. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to join this. What my question has been literally answered asked by the last speaker, and Jason has tried to provide some, insight to it. I was planning to ask based on an individual researcher who is working in a community, probably on a project or interventional research, how best to get the lawyer for that kind of interventional research, especially when it has to do with recovery of abuse. Thank you.
Yeah, if I understand your question, it's how do you find those attorneys? Yeah, I think any attorney you talk to will gladly do the research on your dime. So if I were reaching out to attorneys, I would definitely ask them, what's their experience around fair housing law? so that you're not having to pay for their education, that they understand that attorneys typically specialize in different types of law. And so if they have fair housing background, I think that would be a plus. You know, there's a network of lawyers helping lawyers. These are, you know, individuals, attorneys in recovery that are providing each other peer support. Those programs are across the United States. So to the extent that you can network into those groups, you might be able to find attorneys that specialize in fair housing and understand recovery. Otherwise, I would just ask a lot of questions, you know, up front. You know,
thank you so
Christine,
much. But I wouldn't mind if you have a link of such a group. So just join them, probably to start following up with them in case they may need an information with that respect. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I could do some research. I'm trying to think of if I were to find some resources, Amy, could we put those on the website? I'm trying to think of how we could communicate with this audience after today.
I love how you're thinking, which brings us, I think we need to wrap up the Q&A, unfortunately. But I do want to say, kind of tying in, that Jason is going to be back. And then the conversation that we're going to be having next month is all about diversion risk management. And so Jason, if you want to do some research and kind of plug that into your next presentation, that would be amazing. And we actually do have a way to, we're building ways in our website and additional tools so that we can share information about resources. All the resources that are listed in this presentation will be available and listed on the website. And so if we can tuck that, the new resources into next month's presentation, we'll do that. But we can also pull things out as well on our website. So have no fear, we will make sure that folks get resources.
Yeah, I like that because Christine, your question's going to haunt me. No, let's reframe that. Strength-based. You're going to inform my next presentation, and so I'm going to be thinking about that. So thank you.
No, thank you, because it's something that I struggle with, and you know, we became MAT accepting because that was part of becoming certified for OCAR, the Oklahoma NAR affiliate, and we want to do that. But we still have then this other list of things that we don't allow. And how do we make sense of that? And I appreciate your feedback on what we might need to think about and what we might need to do.
Okay, so why don't we go to the next slide? So just a heads up on some things that are coming up with the I-STARR project. So we do have another webinar this month. It's a researcher-specific webinar, and that's on recovery housing mechanisms of action and measurement of key constructs. And at that webinar, we'll have Doug Polson, Lenny Jason, and David Best presenting on topics of the social model and measurement of it, so psychological sense of community and measurement of it, as well as recovery capital and measurement of it. So that's going to be a really exciting webinar. Next month, in February, we have two. Again, Jason Howell is going to be back to be talking more about medications in recovery housing, and he's going to be talking about medication diversion risk management. Thank you, Jason, for coming back for more. And then we'll also have another researcher webinar in February as well, and that is on strengthening causal inference. So if you're a statistician, we'll have other statisticians presenting at this webinar talking about propensity score matching techniques. But with the researcher webinars, we always like to have someone who's really familiar with a topic, do a general overview, but also someone who's been doing recovery housing research using that specific methodology that we'll be focusing on. So we're really lucky to have two statisticians who are not only statisticians, but also have been doing recovery housing research. So that's in February. So the other thing I want to do before we wrap up is talk a little bit about some other things that we do with the I-STARR project. So in addition to this training series, we also fund pilot studies, again, as part of advancing science on recovery housing and recovery housing to support folks on MOUD. And one of our pilot studies is run by Rachel Winograd at the University of Missouri in St. Louis. And we're very fortunate to have Rachel here at our webinar, and she's going to be talking a little bit about her project because there's an opportunity to participate in some research through her pilot study. So Rachel, I'm going to hand things off to you, and your slides are following in this slide.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'll keep this quick because I know we're at the end and some of you probably already heard my spiel before. My name is Rachel and I'm from Missouri, and I'm basically here to put a bee in your bonnet to get ready to complete a survey and share it in your networks in the next few weeks. Next slide, please. The gist of this is that we're trying to develop a measure to assess barriers to implementing or supporting MAT in recovery housing settings. So I know MAT was just one of the many different types of medication classes that Jason described, and Christine, we talked about how you've been required to support it in your houses. And even though a lot of houses are required to support it, there's still a lot of hurdles and barriers, and that's what we're trying to understand better, both the attitudinal hurdles and the very logistic heavy capacity hurdles. Next slide. And we'll go through these next slides quickly. So just want to give you some confidence that we've developed our measure with a lot of community input from recovery housing operators and residents across the country. Next slide. And we are just about ready to launch. So we have two versions of the survey. One is a version for operators, so people who own recovery homes or manage them. And there's then a resident version as well. So for every house operator, they can share the survey with up to 10 of their residents. Everyone is compensated $15 for completing it. Next slide. And here's just a visual image of how that would work. So we'll share the link to the eligibility screener through this platform, or email networks, whatever you. If you're deemed eligible, then you will get automatically directed to the full survey as a housing operator. And after you complete the survey, you'll get a unique link to share with your residents. Then they will complete the survey, and then everybody will get paid. And then we will end up with a lot, hopefully, of nuanced knowledge about the attitudinal problems, so stigma, feeling like it's not real recovery, also looking at these barriers by the different types of medication, because we know people feel differently about methadone compared to buprenorphine compared to naltrexone. And then we're going to have a lot of usable information about capacity barriers, storage, transportation, some of these legal issues discussed today. And then we will hopefully be able to use that to help advance this field broadly, both from a research standpoint and perhaps more importantly, from a practical application standpoint on the ground. Next slide. So all I ask of you now is to get ready and get excited to do this survey and to be ready to spread the word. If you have any questions in the meantime, that project email is right there with a no I-STARR study. And we're just waiting on some final T's to be crossed and I's to be dotted. And then we should be sharing this out, hopefully fingers crossed, before this webinar comes back together again next month. That's all I've got.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. And Rachel's being modest. So the slide that I think is the most important to emphasize is that this whole survey was developed with input from operators and residents and people who are really knowledgeable about recovery housing. She did the work to make sure that these questions are really germane and capture things that are important to know with respect to recovery housing. So it's a really great opportunity to collect some data on a really good measure, and to develop some psychometric properties on that measure so that it can be used in a lot of different kinds of ways. So I'm a bit biased because it's an I-STARR pilot project, but I think that Rachel's done a really great job. So we're really looking forward to seeing what comes from this work. So let's go to our last slide. We are at the point where we can wrap up. Just a reminder, I mentioned at the outset that this is part of a training series. So we're hoping that folks have registered for the series. If you are registered, if you're thinking about registering and you attend all 12, you can earn a certificate of completion. You can earn the opportunity to have your name listed as someone who's participated in this training series on the I-STARR website, but you can also translate your credits or your attendance into CEU credits, NADAC CEU credits. So like I said, if you haven't registered, please consider doing so. We have all the webinars online, but we're hoping that we can also develop, and we will soon have a learning management system so that in addition to us tracking your attendance when you participate in your webinars, in the live webinars, we can also track participation in the ones that you view through the learning management system so that it facilitates getting that CEU credits. And part of the CEU credit process is filling out an evaluation form. So when you leave the webinar, a pop-up screen will appear. So if you're registered or thinking about registering, please fill out the evaluation form at the end. I think that we are, that's it. Just a reminder about, future webinars coming up. The webinars for the researchers, they're the third Tuesday of the month. The provider webinars are the first Tuesday of the month, always the same time. And to learn more about the I-STARR project and activities, you can go to our website, and that website has a specific page all about the trainings, to learn more about the trainings. So thank you very much. Happy New Year to all, and hopefully we'll see you back here again. Bye.